If you ask me my favorite color, I simply cannot give you an answer. But ask me my favorite flower, and friends, it's a poppy, no question. There's just something about the layers of papery petals, wild greenery, and curious pods. Oh my goodness. So let's paint a realistic-ish poppy together in 4 easy-ish steps. Yep, realistic poppies in about 4 steps. First step is sketch. The second step is a wash. Third, contrast detailing, and fourth, linear detailing. And don't worry, I'm going to explain it all and make sure you don't get lost or confused in the process. And remember, even with realistic painting endeavors, we still are chasing the joy. I am using 2 photo references today, friends, but loosely. Honestly, I look at photo references for about the first few minutes of the sketch, and then I usually don't look back. I hope you find the idea of that as freeing as I do, because that's just what it is. Using those reference photos for basic structure is really all you need. And of course, I found photos of poppies that I absolutely love the color, the peachiness, the rosy moments, but I can take it from there and make it even more spectacular. And no, that's not me having an ego about my talents. That's me knowing that I'm going to push those moments from the inspiration photo that I really love. I'm going to make them more intense, more obvious, and more exciting. And maybe the areas that aren't my favorite, I'm going to change them up a bit. That white page, you know, the one that's not going to stay white for long, that's your world, your domain. You do you, boo, all the live long day on that paper. Supplies today are my favorite Academy watercolor paper. It's a cold press, little bit of texture. I am using my M-Gram watercolor palette. Love this so much. And I'm also going to supplement with the Art for Joy's Sake palette a little bit because it just makes sense. And of course, the brushes. I'm using all the brushes today, friends. I'm bringing them all out. And of course, you'll need a pencil. And yeah, that's about it. As I often do, I'm starting with the center of the flower and creating some very basic shapes to reference the inspiration image that I'm working from. And basically I have the center of the flower and then a few soft edged triangles, I guess is the best way to describe it, surrounding the center of that flower. I really love that front facing petal, the one that kind of juts out at you a little bit and scoops towards you. I'm in love with that one and I'm going to put a lot of focus on that one. And I'm making that obvious in my basic shapes here on the sketch. I will go in at this stage as well because later on, the pencil outlines become really important for me when it comes to adding some detailing. And more on that, I promise. I will also often, like I am here, add a suggestion of the linear detail that I plan on bringing in with a paintbrush later on. So those little striations in the petals, I will sometimes sketch those in super lightly just to give myself a sense of how that's going to look and feel later on with a paintbrush. As I continue on in the sketch and refine and edit those basic shapes, I also sometimes will get a little bit darker with my pencils. So basically I'll press a little bit harder because again, I'm not going to erase these pencil marks. That's just not my style. I'll tell you what, friends, I'm not loving this pencil. I'm gonna switch it out for my favorite HB. Bringing that in, Faber-Castell all the way, baby. Continuing to edit the center of the flower, continuing to refine those shapes. The biggest thing that I can tell you with sketching a flower, any flower really, and especially a flower that's a 3/4 view or a side view, the petals are kind of congregating together at the base of the flower. So you want to make sure that when the petals start to go back towards the base of the flower, they get skinnier. So the petal, when it's closer to you, it's going to be its widest, its most bulbous. And then as that petal goes back towards the base of the flower where they're all congregating at one point, they get skinnier. That general rule is going to really help the perspective of your flower. And the same thing kind of goes for petals that are really from a full-on legit side view. as that petal nears the center of the flower, it's going to get skinnier and skinnier. So take a look at your last flower that you felt was kind of wonky and it just didn't kind of flow. I'm going to put bets on the fact that some of your petals might have been too wide as they reach the center of the flower. Now, I mentioned I love poppy pods, and oh my gosh, there's just something about that delicious shape. It's an oval with attitude. And so I'm always adding pods. I do not have a photo reference for this, and I don't care, because I have these poppy pod shapes written on my heart and I could draw them with my eyes closed. But friends, it's basically an oval that you add some linear moments to and some zhuzh. And I know what you're thinking, Christy, those stems, how do you get that effortless looking curved stem? And the secret is a loose hand, a loose wrist, and a loose arm. And basically a light stroke. If you're laying down a dark stroke, and if you're going dark, number one, you're either super confident and you know you've just got this, so a dark mark doesn't matter. Number two, you're so filled with anxiety that you're stressing out on the page. So a light hand, a light mark is going to give you that whimsical, effortless stroke of a line. And once you've got that beautiful curved stroke down, you just kind of go next to it and mirror that line again. It certainly takes some practice, but loosen up, lighten up, and you'll be on your way. All right, getting that second flower in, friends. Again, I started with the center. Poppy flower centers, especially the oriental poppies that I'm sketching here right now, the centers are so important. They're bold, they're strong, and honestly, I'm making mine bolder and stronger than they even are in the photos. And then coming out, this is a top-down view, face-on view, whatever you want to call it, and I'm just creating some really lovely, these almost look like cabbage rose, garden rose petals. They're big, floppy, they've got really kind of casual silhouettes, a lot of loop-de-loos and floop-de-doos. There you go, I said the crazy words. But I think you get my point in that keeping that pencil moving, I can't even really break this down for you. There's no teardrop shape to start with. You know me and my teardrops. Friends, it's just a casual shape. Some of them are gonna come to a point, some of them are gonna be rounded on the ends, but don't be terribly specific about the petal shapes for your top-down front view flower, because we're going to do a ton of editing with the paint later on. All right, here we go. I have this bud that's kind of almost ready to open and flower. I'm going to sketch that in, and this definitely is more of a teardrop shape that's got a few little folds and bumps on either side of it. And there you have it. Simple. Poppy leaves are like little aliens with arms and tentacles, and they're just the craziest, goofiest leaves that I absolutely adore. So really anything goes here, but basically I start sketching one edge of the leaf in and out, meandering, looking like little creepy witch fingers. Yeah, I did just say witch fingers, but seriously, yeah. Kind of makes sense. And then just go ahead and mirror that kind of movement and sketch line on the other side, and you'll have a crazy, insane, wonderfully beautiful looking leaf when you're done. And friends, don't be too worried about your leaves. They're gonna look weird at this stage. They are not gonna make sense at this stage, but I promise you, hang on, because they're going to evolve and make so much more sense later on. All right, sketching's done. Friends, this is the wash part. This is wet on dry. If you want to know more about this technique, it is my favorite technique, one I use almost all the time to start a painting. I'm going to link a video below. It is really a good one. If you haven't seen it yet, you need to watch it. But basically, wet on dry is wet color from your brush applied to a dry paper. And that's what I'm doing here. Peaches, pinks, touches of yellow, and even a skosh of red is what I'm using for this basic wash of color. And I'm washing color everywhere. I'm leaving nothing undone. I'm using the 1/2-inch dagger at this point, and mostly I'm using that curved edge. The tip of the brush, but the full curved edge tip. And depending on how I hold my brush, the angle of my hand, the angle of the brush, I can really get in there into the nooks and the crannies of these petals and get it in a stroke or 2 or 3. And that's what I love about the dagger. I just want to bring this up about a dagger that a round brush really can't quite capture. The dagger, with just a few simple strokes, you can start to suggest direction and dimension on anything you paint, especially flower petals, because of the shape of that short edge of the brush. Love it. As I'm laying down these washes, I want you to notice that in some areas where petals are meeting and converging, I am darkening the wash just a little bit. A few extra dabs of color, like that red in that first flower, right where that front-facing petal that juts out at you meets the one right underneath it. I'm going ahead and I'm adding a little bit of extra intensity. Don't go overboard with that at this point though, because really you want things light and bright and washy at this stage. Now, just as I say that, I go in with a Payne's Gray. I'm referencing this color specifically because it's one that is so incredibly useful. And I'll tell you what, if you don't have a Payne's Gray in your life, get it and get it quick. It's a good one. You can mix a Payne's Gray. I call it a muddy color. It's the color that converges in the corners of your palette. If you're a big mixer, kind of on the palette type of person, it's just basically all the colors. But Payne's Gray, oh, it's a done for you, dark, beautiful, neutral. Okay, enough of that. But I am known for going into a painting early with darker tones, and it helps me mentally, emotionally. I love the kind of instant gratification of applying darks early on in a painting. I also love, from kind of a technical point of view, you get an idea of the structure of the item you're painting a lot better when you can add a little bit of dark in key areas early on. So I added the darkness in the center of that flower, and it really just brought to life the structure of the flower. And it also showed me some areas that I know I'm gonna have to watch out for as I go and move on in this painting. And that, for example, just so you know, I realized that the center, that very round center, is too round for this 3/4 view. It needs to be more of an oval, but I'm gonna attack that later on. Continuing on the washes here, and it's that same technique, wet on dry. Now with this second flower, look at these few little strokes that I added, just simple saturated strokes. Rinse my brush, come back with a damp brush, do a few more strokes, letting that paint run out, but towards the end of the petals. I'm working from the inside out, and then add a little more water and the peach onto my brush. So a little bit of dampness, a little bit of that gorgeous peach from the Art for Joy's Sake palette, and then continue to work out those dark saturated strokes that I added from the inside out. And look at some of the gorgeous little detailing, little ombre effects that you're getting from those simple strokes. So again, we started with a saturated few strokes towards the center, working it out, blending it out with either clean water on the brush or light layers of color on your brush. Look at that, gorgeous. And before you know it, literally in like a minute, you have a gorgeous wash all over this flower. Love it so much. Now remember, I always say the wet page is an opportunity. So this flower is damp all over. It's a great time to add in some more intense pinks if you feel like you want them towards the center of the flower. And I'm adding in some very soft moments of yellow to just give things kind of a sunshiny, light is hitting it type of vibe. Going into the greens, I've got this gorgeous olive green from my Art for Joy's Sake palette. It is my favorite color in the palette. And I'm still using that 1/2-inch dagger. If you feel like it's too big, move on to a smaller round. If you don't even have my brushes, which is fine, you don't need them to paint with me, just move to a smaller brush if you feel like you're out of control or going outside the lines. So you're good. Same thing goes here. As we move through this second step, just continue to add your colors. Continue to identify areas that you can dab a little bit of extra color in to intensify and start creating some depth. Oh, I love doing that. And when the page is still wet, just remember to add in some interest with some extra greens or pinks or peaches or whatever makes sense in that particular area. And that is basically how this second step goes. One of my favorites. I love the freedom here. I love seeing the start of a painting really come to life and really get juicy and lovely. Now I'm really getting into the greens now, friends, and remember, you're going to have your favorites. You're going to have your favorite greens. You can have favorites in every color family, but with greens especially, get creative. Get creative, and every time you go back to your palette, pick up a little bit of a different green, even if it's on just part of your brush, and let it dab into that wet part of the page and explode. You are not going to be sorry for getting creative with your greens. That is my humble opinion. I love variety. I love a lot going on in a painting, and that's always going to be my approach here. So do with that what you will. If too many greens is too much and it stresses you out, do what you will. You do you, boo. Heading back to the center of that second flower with all the darkness and the lovely from the Payne's Gray. And I'm immediately also noticing here that the round center is way too round, but I'll adjust that later on. No worries. In an effort to keep the dark areas at this point from feeling too dark, I am keeping my brush clean, going back, and I added a little peach there in the middle. I'm really glad I did. I love the kind of highs and lows that's creating in a really kind of interesting way. And that is a perfect example, friends, of the way that I kind of go off-road, so to speak, from the inspiration images. And I love being able to do that, and I love having the confidence to do that. And I want you to hear this. You can go rogue from your inspiration photos as a beginner. You do not need to have a ton of experience under your belt to decide you want to intensify a color or add a different color or whatever it may be. You are allowed to do the crazy things, even as a beginner. So friends, let's head into comments as I'm wrapping up this second step here. Let me know your favorite part of the poppies so far. Let me know. Is it the dark centers? Is it the peachy colors? Whatever it is, I want to hear it. And friends, while you're here, if you're having a blast like I am, we're having a little painting party here, go ahead, give this video a boop. That's a like, because it really helps folks find our channel and get in on all this fun, because you know this community is awesome. I want more people to know this community is awesome. Okay, enough of that. Time for step number 3, contrast detailing. There's one other video on this channel where I get into contrast detailing. I'm going to link it below. It's a good one. But friends, basically it has to do with adding color to an edge of a shape and then taking a clean, damp brush and blending out that color. So it's kind of like a smash up of outlining with watercolor and shadows. Yeah. At the very top flower here, you can see I'm adding some bright pink. And notice I'm not adding these bright saturated strokes of bright pink everywhere along the shape or the edge of that petal, just in certain places. Going back in with a clean-ish damp brush and blending that bright pink out. And I'm always blending, well, almost always blending a little bit down towards the center of the flower initially, but then usually I'm blending back upwards towards the edge or the outermost edge of that petal. And what that eventually does is create a really strong saturation of color along the edge where you first put the color down. And it creates such lovely, intense contrast. Hence, contrast detailing. All right, I'm gonna keep painting, but I want you to hear me. This is really important. This is the heart and soul of the way I approach more realistic watercolor. It's this third step where you've got your sketching, you've got your basic washes laid down. Now it's time to revisit all the shapes and start to really get everything to go backward into the distance or to pop forward. So with flowers, it's figuring out how to make certain petals look like they're behind other petals or nestled down deep towards the center of the flower, and then how to make other petals appear like they're jutting forward and coming at you. I'm going to break it down. It is truly simple. You're basically figuring out where to put strong color and in which direction to blend that strong color. Right now I'm working on the right-hand side of the flower, that little petal that is truly a full side view. And I want that petal to definitely feel like it's popping forward towards the viewer. So I'm adding dark strokes, actually more bright than dark, but intense saturated strokes of color on the left-hand curved edge of that petal and down as it tucks down in towards the center of the flower. And then I'm blending out towards the dark Payne's Gray center of this flower. And before you know it, it very much looks like that side view curved peachy light petal is popping out, popping forward. And then you also at the same time have an immediate sense of the depth in that area of the flower. Now you're probably wondering, Christy, that's great. I get that description. That's fantastic. But how do I figure out where to put these intense saturated strokes of color? And that's a more difficult question to answer. It's not as simple because it takes a certain familiarity with the structure of a flower. I've been painting flowers for a very long time. I have studied the anatomy of flowers, botanical illustrations, you name it. That doesn't mean that as a beginner you can't capture a realistic vibe. It just means there's gonna be some struggle bus moments for sure. One thing you can do before you dive into this step is kind of casually, mentally map out the petals that are going to be kind of going backwards in your field of view and the ones that are going to be popping forward. And just mentally take note, okay, I want the frontmost and the left and the right petals to really kind of look like they're coming forward, and then everything else is going to go backward. All right, I'm over on the left-hand side here, and I'm adding some really strong kind of a red, just a really bright red. Use what you have. And immediately laying down that red is making that front-facing petal that I'm so excited about. I mentioned it earlier. I love that very front-facing petal, and I want to make sure she just pushes forward without any doubt. I want there to be no doubt where that petal is in this composition. So I'm really doubling down on the intensity right where those two petals meet and adding that bright red and then blending, making sure though in my blending that I'm not losing the intensity right where those two petals meet. Something that I do a lot is, and it depends on whether I'm using watercolor pencils or just straight up watercolor or watercolor markers, I will go in and I call it notching out areas with the most intense but small areas of dark color. Right now I'm using Payne's Gray. And this can get tricky and quick because if I pop in too much Payne's Gray right over top of that red that I just laid down, my petals are gonna start to look like they're dying. Like they're literally gonna look dark and dingy and muddy. And I don't want that. What I do want is a very concentrated area or a few small, teeny tiny areas that really, really pop. And I can do that with a little dab or a little line of a dark color, in this case Payne's Gray, in certain areas. I will be doing this throughout the entire composition at this point. It's one of my little tricks. Moving on, now I'm going further down on the left underneath the last petal that I was at. And again, I have another opportunity to get that front-facing petal to really pop. But I also have a petal that's underneath, that light petal that's on the left underneath where I'm working right now with the reds. I want that petal to also look like it's popping forward a bit. So I've mentioned this in other videos. It's not always about what you're actually painting. It's not about what petal you're painting, what surface you're actually painting on at any given moment. It's also about what you're revealing around the piece of the painting you're painting. So you have to think about the positive space, which is the thing you're painting in the moment, the thing you're actually applying paint to, and then the negative space, which is basically everything around it. And that is definitely a less than traditional explanation of negative space, but I think it helps and I think it makes sense. So don't come at me in the comments. I'm also using a classic technique called glazing. And so contrast detailing basically goes hand in hand with glazing. And some people would just be like, girl, you're glazing, like cut it out with the contrast detailing. But I like to break things down as much as possible. So on the very, very bottommost petal, the one that's underneath my star petal, I went over the entire petal, which was super light peach, with a more intense peach. I glazed over the entire petal. If you want to know more about glazing, I have a full step-by-step in-depth video. I'm going to link it below, where I paint a tulip in that style. I'm heading down to the second flower here, the one that is fully front-facing, and applying this same contrast detailing technique. Adding the red with the tip of my 1/4-inch dagger, and then rinsing off camera here, friends. I'm going to bring it back in and blend out. And again, I'm always keeping at the top of my mind which petal's coming forward, which petal's going behind. And just a note about inspiration images again at this point. I mentioned earlier, at this stage in the painting, I haven't looked at my inspiration photo in probably an hour, but that's okay. You can make the things up. You know that some petals are going to come forward, some are going to go backward. This is your world, you do you. I think my point is that I don't want you to feel like you're beholden or a prisoner to that inspiration photo. I always say the wet page is an opportunity, and with contrast detailing, it certainly is. So remember, as you're working through your composition, adding in your moments of really intense color and then blending out with that clean, damp brush, remember that that surface now is damp or wet. It should really be more damp than wet though. And you can go in and dab in soft moments of additional color or bright moments of additional color and see how they blend at this stage. I love just going back and forth, adding my contrast detailing, scooping out some of the color, lifting out some of the color, and when the page is wet, dabbing some color back in, and that back and forth can create some of the most lovely blended ombre effects that you could possibly imagine. So definitely don't be so strict that I'm doing contrast detailing now and I can't add any more color than what is needed. No, friends, get into it and just lean into the process and work back and forth, in and out, all over and around with these techniques. Another tip that I have for painting with this realistic kind of style is that remember, when you start to blend an area, blend in the direction and even in the shape of, in this example, the petal that you're painting on, because that can really help create further dimension. You just don't know what might happen. You might have a little bit of the color on the edge of your brush, and when you sweep up in the direction and within the contour of that petal shape, you might create a really cool little stroke of color that you hadn't planned. So I am precious often. I know I say not to be precious, but I am precious often in how and in which direction and in the shapeliness of the strokes that I put down, even when I'm just blending with what I think is just clean water on my brush. Now at this point, you may feel that tugging at your creative soul to also add some linear detail. I always am adding linear detail at this stage of the painting. It's not just about the contrast detailing at this point for me. Take the tip of your 1/4-inch dagger or the very point of your round brush if you're using that, and add little moments of linear detail following the contours of the item that you're painting. So right now I'm painting the pods, and you see I'm just sweeping down lightly and creating some of those moments of linear detail. If you're curious about what the heck linear detail is and how to best create it, I actually love a liner brush for it. I'm gonna link a video below all about using your liner brush. You're gonna love it. As I continue to paint here, friends, I wanna give you a couple of tips for this third stage of the realistic-ish painting, because it's such an important stage. Number 1, take your time. This is the point of the painting where I definitely slow down. I'm definitely much more methodical. I really consider what I'm about to do before I do it. Now, that's not to say I'm just willy-nilly haphazard the rest of the time that I'm painting, but the sketching and the washy sections of this painting technique are definitely more instinctive and a lot quicker. This stage works best with more consideration. Now, I don't want you to get super nitpicky and critical of yourself, because then you're just going to put that paintbrush down and you're going to walk away. I know, but just a little bit more thought and a smidge more planning and you'll be good to go. Number 2, this takes more concentration. I can do a sketch and a watercolor wash amidst absolute chaos, children running everywhere, all the things. But when it comes to these detailed shadows and the contrast detailing, I definitely need to be in a quieter spot, so give yourself the space that you need knowing that. Number 3, step back often, because this particular technique can become so meditative, so cathartic. You can easily kind of get tunnel vision. And so even if you have to set a timer for yourself every, say, 10 minutes, do it so that you can get up, stretch, breathe, and step back to make sure you're not overdoing any particular area. And probably most importantly, stepping back gives you a chance to see the dimension that's unfolding right before your eyes that sometimes that you can lose sight of when you're super focused. So I actually really enjoy the breaks and the stepping back part of this process because it's incredibly satisfying. You get to step back and be like, wow, look at that dimension. Look what I just created. All right, there is actually kind of an added step in here. So let's call it like step 3.A or something. It's where I actually go in with a dark color, just like I did there, super dark green in this case. And I'm adding some leafy moments around the flowers that are meant to, of course, number 1, add interest, but number 2, more importantly, I'm really pushing the contrast between the foreground flowers and what's in the background. So I'm basically using the background elements, the leaves, the dark leaves, to push the contrast, push the realism. And see, I'm going right in the middle there where there's a little bit of negative space, a little white space, and I'm notching out some of those petal shapes, but I'm doing it by using green in the background. So I didn't really feel like I needed to make this a full extra step. It's definitely related to contrast detailing, but yeah, it was worth a call out. And I'll say this, adding these type of details to your painting at this point might feel a little nerve-wracking, especially if you're really happy with what you've created so far. The thought of adding moments to the painting that you haven't sketched in might feel like just too much and too risky, and that's fine. Skip it. You don't have to add these dark moments if you don't want to. Now, here's how I identify where to put these darker moments that I haven't necessarily sketched in. If there's an area that I really feel needs some attention, needs some depth, it's not popping, like this particular cluster of pods, these poppy pods, I didn't feel were popping. So that for me was an indicator, let's put a really dark leaf behind some of them. And that's exactly what I did. And by putting that dark leaf behind, everything started to pop forward. If you feel like an area is just looking really flat, like your flower just doesn't feel like it's got that dimension you were hoping for, kind of like you know there's an issue, but you're not sure quite what it is, that could also be a really good indicator of maybe you need some really dark moments, some leaves surrounding some areas of the flower to help give things a little bit of oomph. Here's a tip for you though. Don't overdo it. You don't want to, for example, go around the entire perimeter of a flower with all of these dark leaves, because then it's going to start to look like an outline, a weird kind of wreathy outline. So just keep that in mind. Here's another tip for you. On one of those breaks that you set a timer for, I want you to take a look at areas where you think maybe you need to add something, like maybe you need to sketch something in. So don't be afraid to sketch in halfway, 3/4 of the way through your painting session. I felt like I wanted to add another poppy pod over top of where that big petal was, that second flower at the bottom. I felt like that topmost petal was ill-shaped and just too much. And so adding another little pod there was a really perfect way of cutting into that petal shape. All right, friends, let me know. Comment below with a big ol' yes exclamation point if you plan on trying your own version of this. And also let me know which flower you're gonna give a go. And while you're at it, you know what I'm about to say. If you're having as much fun as I am, and I hope you are, give this video a boop. That's a like. I can always tell when I'm really happy with a painting because I feel like I'm on the verge of breaking into song, but I promise I'll spare you this time. Now, I've been waxing poetic about these dark moments, leafy moments that you add in at this stage without a sketch. But how do you get those super dark colors? So here's just a little tip on some super fast and loose color mixing. You want to start with a green. Get a decent amount of it on your brush. In fact, way more than decent. You want to get a lot of it on your brush. So if I had to put it into mathematical terms, which you know how I feel about that, but I would say about 80% pigment, 20% water on your brush. Get a little bit of that on your palette and then start grabbing some reds, a little bit of blue, even a little bit of purple, even a little bit of brown. Basically all the colors. And if you feel it's not green enough at that point, add a little more green back in. And that's going to give you that really juicy, intense, dark, slightly opaque color that you need to add some of those moments in. And you can basically do that and start with any color. So instead of starting with green, start with blue and add some things in. There's a reason I don't call out specific colors here. You'll literally hear me say like an intense blue or an emerald green, because I don't want you to worry about what I have on my palette compared to what you might have on yours. All right, I'm heading back down into the leftmost corner here. Felt like I needed a little something there compositionally. I just wanted some organic moments shooting off down into the bottom corner, and those are going to be some side view poppy blooms, and yeah, super simple. Just a reminder that your petals should be their skinniest where they're meeting up with the base of the flower and the stem. All right, now before we get fully into step number 4, our last step, and friends, if you're still with me, oh my gosh, you are brave, but I at least hope this has been so far inspirational and fun, and if it has, go ahead and give this video a boop. That's a like. I added these little side view blooms very late in the game, so I want to get them back up to the level of detail of everything else. So that's basically what I'm doing at this point. Adding the washes, adding some contrast detailing, and moving on. All right, step number 4, linear detail. What do I mean by linear detail? Basically, it's adding detail in a collection of repeated, thin, delicate, wispy lines. And I like to do that best with a liner brush. I use the liner brush from my own collection, the Art for Joy's Sake collection. It is synthetic brush bristles that I adore because they have a certain amount of bounce back. And so if you are attempting this with a liner that has natural bristles, you might feel really frustrated because natural bristle brushes don't have the same snap back and bounce back. You might find yourself constantly having to kind of reshape and get started again. Okay, so think about it this way. Think about a topographical map and how the lines on a topo map kind of follow the contours of the land. So the way that I add this detailing is very similar. I follow the contours of whatever it is I'm painting the detail on top of. So today it's poppy petals. And so I'm looking at the silhouette, the shape of the line, the outline that I originally sketched. And in a lot of ways, in most places then, the detailing that I add with my liner brush is just going to follow or mirror that outline or that original sketch mark that I made. Easy peasy, right? Oh my gosh. Let's keep going. So here's what you want to do. You don't need to mix up a whole palette full of special color. Think about it this way. These are peach poppies. I've used a lot of peach. I've used a ton of pink. I've even used red. And we're essentially going to just maintain that same palette. Some of the areas, most of the areas, you're using contrast to get your detailing to really show. What does that mean? Lighter petal, darker linear details. Now, you could certainly get into the darker areas that you laid down with the contrast detailing in step 3, but you would either need to have a really saturated amount of watercolor on your brush or use gouache. And that's a whole other video, so let's get back to basics. All right, I'm going to be working in that topmost petal, just below the cluster of poppy pods. And you certainly could use a round brush. Let me show you. You can get those thin lines. They're not going to be as thin. You can probably squeak out thin lines, but it's going to feel a lot more labor intensive, and I think you might get frustrated. So if you can get your hands on a liner brush or on a super teeny tiny round brush, you're going to feel much better about life. Trust me. All right, here we go. Lines don't need to be continuous. They can be broken up in areas. That's rule number 1. And I would suggest bringing in lines that are broken up, little dots and dashes. Number 2, the lines certainly don't need to be the same thickness as you go. And in this flower in particular, thicker lines could almost represent a fold in the flower petal, which I love. Number 3, your lines are going to usually converge to more of a point as they move towards the center of the flower. Let me repeat that because that sounds like wow. Okay, so remember earlier on in the video when I talked about sketching flower petals, especially kind of that front view, top-down view, that your petals were going to get thinner and narrower as they went towards the center of the flower. Well, your lines are going to kind of follow the same rule. Your lines, the repeated lines, the linear detail that you're adding, those are going to converge at a similar tapered point that goes towards the center of your flower. Now, friends, you, I'm sure, have questions like, what in the world, did you just mean? Head into comments, friends. I try to reply to every single comment that comes through. It's gotten a lot harder these days, but I'm still working on it. If you have questions, please don't let them linger. Please ask, and I will do my utmost to reply. All right, moving on to the right-hand side of the flower here. I definitely got a dark red on my brush. If I had to quantify it, I would say it's about 60% pigment, 40% water. You're probably going to feel like you need to reload often, and that is normal, especially when you're using the darker colors. You're definitely going to be reloading more often. Notice what I did there on that right-hand side, that little tiny petal that's kind of curving out, the one that looks a little bit more like a rose petal. I thought that was fun. I am creating these continuous lines over and over again that are kind of like a frowny face, right? And it's immediately, instantly making that little petal look so curved beyond a shadow of a doubt. That is a curved petal, and it's all because of the linear detail. Love it. Now, as I move on further down this petal, my lines are not converging at as much of a point. And I just love that variety. Remember, when your lines converge closer and closer together, that can look like even an area of shadow. So think about your linear detail not just adding volume and interest, they actually could be adding shadow and depth. Rinsed my brush, adding some Payne's gray, and I'm going into the center of this flower, adding some scribbly moments, literally where I'm scribbling with my liner brush because there's that ring of ruffliness that I really want to capture. You might want to take a look back at the inspiration photo at this point. I did. I know. I don't look at it that much, but I definitely did because I wanted to get a sense of what Mother Nature was doing with the center of that flower. And there's just a lot of ruffliness, dots, dashes, swirlies, whoop-de-doos, you know the drill, around that center ball, so to speak, for lack of a better word. I decided to bring in some curious color into the ruffly ring in that center of the flower, some rusty reds. I felt like there was just a definitive warmth going on in the inspiration photo at the flower center, and I wanted to capture that, and I'm so glad I did. And at this point, I'm bringing in my number 2 round for a little foray into the flower at this point, because I wanted a stronger, more definitive dot dash type of mark, and I wasn't getting it from the liner brush. Back in with the liner brush. Oh gosh, I feel like I could spend an hour just in the center of this flower. And one of the last things that I want to do here is add some strong linear detail in a few areas using that Payne's gray. I've got it loaded up heavily on my brush and just stroking it from the center and outwards in different ways. I'm really experimenting here. I don't have a plan at this point. This final step in the center of the flower, I'm totally experimenting, and that is okay. Headed back over to the left-hand side petal here that's got all that glowy yellow on it. And notice how I added linear detail, but it was a thicker line that almost looked like a controlled wash. Adding in some more linear details, and notice the color here. I'm not going crazy. I'm just using kind of a washed out pink, something that was already on my palette, not being precious about the color here. As long as the contrast right now, I felt like I didn't want a strong contrast on this left side petal. So I'm keeping a lot of water in the mix, but look at that. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. Lay down a couple strokes as you go. Take a break. Look away and look back. Look away and look back. Couple more strokes. Make sure you're happy with how things are going. But continue to be decisive and instinctive. Don't get yourself hung up in making decisions about every single line, every single stroke at this stage. Give yourself freedom, but just keep an eye on things. Making sure that your eyes are fresh as you work through these more detailed compositions is so important. And it can be as simple as looking away, glancing at the flower pot next to you, glancing at an art print on the wall for a few moments, and looking back. It can be as simple as that. All right, I've been talking a lot, friends, so let's just take a look here. Let's paint for a little bit. Let's just see it unfold, and I will shut my mouth for a few moments. I feel like I've thrown a lot of quote unquote rules at you today. So let's talk about the 5 watercolor rules that were made to be broken. And friends, I hope you've enjoyed some happy painting today.